The story of the United States of America does not begin with a single act of defiance, but rather in the slow, agonizing collision of worlds and the gradual awakening of a new identity on the edge of a vast, untamed continent. For over a century, the 13 colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast were merely distant outposts of the British Empire, diverse in religion, economy, and social structure, yet bound by a shared status as subjects of the Crown. In the north, the rugged landscape of New England fostered a culture of tight, knit maritime communities and religious fervor, while in the south, the fertile soil gave rise to expansive plantations and a landed gentry. Despite these differences, by the mid-18th century, a common thread began to weave through the colonial experience, the sense that the Atlantic Ocean was not just a geographic barrier, but a widening psychological chasm. The seeds of revolution were sown not in a desire for war, but in the aftermath of one. The French and Indian War had left Great Britain as the dominant power in North America, but it also left the royal treasury depleted. When Parliament looked toward the colonies to help pay the debt through a series of unprecedented taxes, they struck a nerve that went deeper than finance. From the Stamp Act to the Townshend Acts, the cry of no taxation without representation echoed through the cobblestone streets of Boston and the tobacco fields of Virginia. It was a fundamental disagreement over the nature of rights and the reach of an empire. The colonists, many of whom had fled Europe to escape rigid hierarchies, began to view themselves not as secondary citizens, but as inheritors of the Enlightenment's promise that all men possessed inherent liberties. The tension reached a breaking point in the cold, winter air of 1770 during the Boston Massacre, and again in 1773 when the harbor waters turned dark with dumped tea. These were no longer mere protests. They were the tremors of a coming earthquake. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, marking the first time these disparate entities acted as a single political body. Yet, even then, many hoped for reconciliation. It was not until the spring of 1775, when the first shots were fired on the greens of Lexington and Concord, that the path to peace was finally severed. The shot heard round the world signaled the start of an improbable conflict where a collection of farmers, merchants, and laborers stood against the most powerful military force on the planet. As the smoke cleared from those initial skirmishes, the ideological foundation of the new nation was laid by a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. In the summer of 1776, the Declaration of Independence was drafted, transforming a regional rebellion into a global crusade for human rights. It was a document of breathtaking audacity, asserting that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. But words on parchment could not win a war. The American Revolution was a grueling test of endurance, defined by the winter shadows of Valley Forge, where General George Washington's Continental Army nearly dissolved from hunger and cold. Washington, a man of immense gravity and quiet resolve, became the living symbol of the Revolution, holding a fractured army together through sheer force of will and a series of daring gambles, such as the crossing of the icy Delaware River on Christmas night. The turning point came not just through American resilience, but through the vital support of the French, whose naval power and resources finally tipped the scales. In 1781, at the Siege of Yorktown, the British forces under Lord Cornwallis were trapped between American troops and the French fleet, forcing a surrender that effectively ended the military struggle. However, The victory on the battlefield was only the beginning of a more difficult challenge, the creation of a working government. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, proved too weak to hold the states together, leaving the young nation vulnerable to internal collapse and foreign intervention. In 1787, the brightest minds of the age gathered once more in Philadelphia for a secret convention. What was intended as a revision of the Articles became the birth of the United States Constitution. Through a scorching summer of heated debate and brilliant compromise, figures like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin crafted a blueprint for a federal republic. They envisioned a system of checks and balances designed to prevent the rise of tyranny, balancing the power of the states with the necessity of a strong central authority. It was a great experiment, a gamble on the idea that a people could govern themselves through reason and law rather than through the whims of a monarch. The ratification of the Constitution led to the inauguration of George Washington as the first president in 1789. Standing on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, he took the oath of office for a nation that was still more of a concept than a reality. The founding years were a period of intense fragility, where every decision set a precedent and every disagreement threatened to tear the Union apart. The debate between the Federalists, who favored industrial growth and a strong central bank, and the Democratic Republicans, who envisioned an agrarian society of independent farmers, created the first political parties. Yet, through this friction, the American identity began to solidify. By the turn of the 19th century, the United States had survived its infancy. It had survived a second war with Britain in 1812, which confirmed its independence once and for all, and it had begun to look westward. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the country overnight, opening a vast frontier that promised endless opportunity, but also sowed the seeds of future conflict over the expansion of slavery. This was a nation born of high ideals and deep contradictions, a country that spoke of liberty while millions remained in chains. Yet it was a country that had fundamentally changed the course of human history. The founding era was not just a series of dates and battles, but the story of a people attempting to build a house that could hold the aspirations of the entire world. It was a time of fire and philosophy, where the old world's shadows were pushed back by the dawn of a new, uncertain, and wildly ambitious American era. As the 19th century dawned, the young United States began to vibrate with a restless, almost frantic energy. The coastlines were no longer enough to contain the ambitions of a people who viewed the horizon not as a boundary, but as an invitation. This era, often defined by the concept of manifest destiny, was driven by the intoxicating belief that the American people were divinely ordained to spread their institutions, their commerce, and their way of life from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was not merely a period of geographic growth. It was a total transformation of the American soul. The invention of the steamboat and the construction of the Erie Canal began to stitch the continent together, turning the wilderness into a marketplace and the Great Lakes into an inland sea of commerce. The silence of the frontier was replaced by the whistle of the locomotive and the rhythmic thumping of industrial looms in the north, marking the birth of a global economic powerhouse. However, this rapid expansion came with a profound and tragic cost. As the American footprint grew, the ancestral lands of indigenous nations were systematically dismantled. The era of Andrew Jackson brought with it a fierce, populist spirit that championed the common man, yet it simultaneously enacted the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This led to the Trail of Tears, a forced migration of thousands of Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people toward the west. Thousands perished from cold, hunger, and disease, leaving a permanent scar on the nation's conscience. This duality, of expanding liberty for some while crushing it for others, became the defining paradox of the American identity during these decades. The frontier was a place of reinvention and hope for the pioneer, but for the native inhabitants, it was the site of a slow and agonizing displacement. While the nation pushed westward, a deeper, more dangerous rift was forming between the North and the South. The Industrial Revolution had taken firm root in the northern states, creating a society built on free labor, manufacturing, and urban growth. In stark contrast, the South had become increasingly tethered to King Cotton. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, which was intended to simplify labor, had the unintended consequence of making large-scale slavery more profitable than ever. The South's economy, social hierarchy, and political power became inextricably linked to the institution of human bondage. By the 1830s and 40s, the United States was essentially two different civilizations living under one flag, bound by a constitution that had carefully avoided the word slave, but could no longer ignore its reality. The acquisition of vast new territories following the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s accelerated this brewing crisis. The victory brought California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona and New Mexico into the Union, but it also forced a terrifying question to the forefront of American politics. Would these new lands be free or slave? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had provided a temporary truce, but the gold rush of 1849 and the sudden surge of settlers into California shattered the old agreements. The Compromise of 1850 was a desperate attempt to hold the Union together, introducing the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northern citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. This act radicalized the North, turning quiet citizens into abolitionists and fueling the fires of the Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of safe houses led by courageous figures like Harriet Tubman. The 1850s were a decade of unraveling. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe brought the moral horrors of slavery into Northern parlors, making the issue personal and unavoidable. In the plains of Kansas, the struggle turned bloody as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought for control, an event known as Bleeding Kansas that served as a grim preview of the coming war. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857 further pushed the nation toward the precipice, ruling that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress had no power to forbid slavery in the territories. It was a legal earthquake that seemed to strip away any hope of a peaceful political solution. The voice of a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln began to rise above the noise, arguing that a house divided against itself cannot stand. As the election of 1860 approached, the political landscape of America fractured. The newly formed Republican Party, led by Lincoln, campaigned on a platform of halting the expansion of slavery. When Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, the South saw it as a final rejection of their way of life. South Carolina was the first to act, declaring its secession from the Union in December 1860, followed quickly by 6 other states. They formed the Confederate States of America, drafting their own constitution and seizing federal property within their borders. The dream of a unified, continental republics seemed to be collapsing in real time. The tension finally reached its breaking point on a misty April morning in 1861 at Fort Sumter, a federal outpost in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. When Confederate batteries opened fire on the fort, the period of debate and compromise was over. The American Civil War had begun. It was a war that would pit brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor, testing whether a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could truly endure. The conflict was no longer just about territory or tariffs. It was a struggle for the very soul of the republic. For the next 4 years, the United States would be engulfed in the bloodiest chapter of its history, a trial by fire that would eventually destroy the institution of slavery, but at a cost that would haunt the American landscape for generations to come. As the armies mobilized, the scale of the coming tragedy was still unfathomable to most. Young men in the North and South marched off to war with a sense of adventure, believing the conflict would be resolved in a single, decisive battle. They could not have known they were entering a war of attrition that would introduce the world to the horrors of modern combat. Trench warfare, ironclad ships, and the devastating power of rifled muskets. The initial optimism soon faded into the grim reality of the battlefield, as names like Bull Run, Antietam, and Shiloh became synonymous with unprecedented slaughter. Abraham Lincoln, standing in the center of this storm, found himself transforming from a politician into a wartime leader who had to navigate the most complex moral and strategic challenges any president had ever faced. Through the smoke of these early battles, the ultimate meaning of the war began to shift. What started as a struggle to preserve the Union was evolving into a crusade for human liberation. The pressure on Lincoln to act against slavery grew both from within his own party and from the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who were fleeing toward Union lines, seeking the protection of the army. The stage was set for an act of executive power that would redefine the American mission. The nation was moving through its darkest night, heading toward a crossroads at Gettysburg and a proclamation that would change the world forever. The year 1862 brought a sobering realization to both the North and the South. The American Civil War would not be a brief or bloodless affair. It had evolved into a grueling war of attrition that touched every hearth and home in the divided nation. In the East, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by the tactically brilliant Robert E. Lee, consistently outmaneuvered a succession of Union generals, bringing the fight to the very doorstep of Washington, D.C. The Union's massive advantages in industry, population, and railroads were being neutralized by Southern grit and superior field leadership. However, the nature of the conflict was about to undergo a radical transformation following the horrific Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American military history. President Abraham Lincoln seized the momentum to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This was a strategic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the war's purpose. It was no longer merely a struggle to preserve a political union. It was now a revolutionary crusade to destroy the institution of slavery. By inviting enslaved people to seek freedom behind Union lines and eventually join the ranks of the military, Lincoln turned the South's greatest economic asset into a powerful weapon against them. As 1863 dawned, the weight of the conflict shifted during a single, pivotal week in July. In the small market town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, The Union Army of the Potomac finally halted Lee's northern invasion in a 3-day titanic struggle that left more than 50,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. Simultaneously, far to the west, Ulysses S. Grant successfully concluded the siege of Vicksburg, giving the Union total control over the Mississippi River and effectively slicing the Confederacy in two. These twin victories marked the high-water mark of the rebellion. From this point forward, the South was on the defensive, its resources dwindling and its hope for foreign recognition from Britain or France evaporating. Yet, the war was far from over. The final 2 years were defined by a new and terrifying concept: total war. When Grant was promoted to general-in-chief of all Union armies, he unleashed a relentless, multi-pronged assault designed to break the physical and psychological will of the South. While Grant engaged Lee in a series of brutal, grinding battles in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman led a scorched-earth campaign through Georgia and the Carolinas. Sherman's march to the sea left a path of destruction 60 miles wide, dismantling railroads, burning warehouses, and proving to the Southern population that their government could no longer protect them. The end finally came in April 1865, with Richmond in ruins and his army starving and surrounded. Robert E. Lee met Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse to sign the terms of surrender. The scene was marked by an unexpected dignity. Grant, reflecting Lincoln's desire for a lasting peace, offered generous terms, allowing the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and return to their farms. The celebration of victory, however, was tragically short-lived. Just days after the surrender, the nation was plunged into mourning when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The architect of the Union's salvation was gone at the very moment he was needed most to guide the healing of the country. His death left a void that would be filled by political chaos as the nation entered the turbulent era known as Reconstruction. This was a period of profound hope and devastating failure, a second founding, where the United States attempted to redefine the meaning of citizenship and equality. During Reconstruction, the country ratified 3 landmark amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. For a brief, shining moment, the South was transformed. Biracial governments were formed, public school systems were established for the first time, and African Americans were elected to state legislatures and even the United States Senate. The Freedmen's Bureau worked to provide education and land to formerly enslaved people, attempting to build a foundation for a new, democratic South. However, this progress was met with violent resistance. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan waged a campaign of domestic terrorism, using lynching and intimidation to suppress the black vote and restore white supremacy. The North's will to enforce the new laws began to wither as the country was hit by economic depression and a growing desire for national reconciliation at any cost. By 1877, the great experiment of Reconstruction was effectively abandoned. In a disputed presidential election, a political compromise led to the withdrawal of the last federal troops from the South. Without the protection of the Army, the new civil rights protections collapsed. The Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws, a rigid system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement that would keep African Americans in a state of second-class citizenship for nearly another century. The war had saved the Union and ended slavery, but it had failed to secure true justice or equality. The nation began to turn its eyes away from the unresolved wounds of the South and toward the beckoning promise of the West and the rising smoke of the Gilded Age. The frontier was calling, and a new era of industrial might, massive immigration, and global ambition was about to begin. The scars of the Civil War would remain buried just beneath the surface, a reminder of the price paid for a unified nation and the long road that still lay ahead in the pursuit of a more perfect union. As the 19th century moved toward its close, the American landscape was being reshaped by steel and steam. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 had physically united the country, turning a months-long journey into a matter of days. This technological triumph signaled the end of the traditional frontier and the beginning of an era characterized by the rise of the robber barons, men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, who built vast monopolies and amassed fortunes that rivaled the treasuries of European kingdoms. The United States was no longer a collection of agrarian states. It was becoming an urban, industrial empire. Millions of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were pouring through Ellis Island, drawn by the promise of work and freedom, creating a melting pot of cultures that would define the American city. But this prosperity was unevenly distributed, leading to the birth of the labor movement and a growing tension between the wealthy elite and the working class. The stage was set for the Progressive Era, a time of reform and activism that would seek to address the injustices of the industrial age and prepare the United States to take its place on the world stage as a global power in the 20th century. The post-Civil War era was not just a period of recovery, it was a wholesale reinvention of the American machine. By the late 1870s, the dust of the battlefield had settled, replaced by a thick, black suit that began to blanket the burgeoning cities of the North. This was the dawn of the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe an era that glittered on the surface but masked a core of social conflict and corruption. The nation was undergoing a tectonic shift from an agrarian society to an industrial titan, fueled by an explosion of invention and an insatiable hunger for capital. The patent office was overwhelmed by the likes of Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell, whose light bulbs and telephones were shrinking the world and extending the day. Beneath the feet of every American, the very foundation of the country was changing from wood and stone to steel and oil. In the canyons of Manhattan and the smoke-filled skies of Pittsburgh, a new aristocracy was rising, the captains of industry, or as their critics called them, the robber barons. Andrew Carnegie, a penniless Scottish immigrant, harnessed the Bessemer process to mass-produce steel, providing the skeleton for the modern skyscraper and the tracks for a continental rail network. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller was quietly consolidating the oil industry through Standard Oil, creating a monopoly so vast that it challenged the power of the federal government itself. These men were the architects of a new world, amassing fortunes that dwarfed the riches of old European kings. They built marble palaces in Newport and grand libraries in New York. Yet their empires were constructed on the backs of a working class that remained largely invisible in the shadows of the Gilded Age's brilliance. This industrial explosion required an endless supply of labor, and the world responded. Between 1870 and 1900, nearly 12 million people arrived on American shores, many passing through the gates of Ellis Island. Unlike the earlier waves of British and German settlers, These new immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, Poland, Russia, and the Balkans, bringing with them diverse languages, religions, and traditions. They were the muscle that built the subways, the hands that operated the textile looms, and the voices that filled the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side. The American city became a laboratory of human experience, a chaotic melting pot where the dream of a better life often collided with the harsh reality of the sweatshop and the slum. Life in these urban centers was a struggle for survival, marked by disease, fire, and the relentless pressure of poverty. Yet it was here that the modern American identity began to take its multi-ethnic shape. As the cities swelled, the Old West was undergoing its final, violent transformation. The completion of the transcontinental railroads had made the vast interior of the continent accessible, and the government's Homestead Act promised free land to those willing to tame it. The open range, once the domain of millions of buffalo and nomadic tribes, was carved up by barbed wire and locomotive tracks. The tragic conclusion of the Indian Wars was reached in the late 19th century, culminating in the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee. This event signaled the definitive end of armed indigenous resistance and the symbolic closing of the American frontier. The rugged individualism of the pioneer was being replaced by the structured reality of the rancher and the miner, and the West was officially integrated into the national economy. However, the rapid pace of change created deep fissures in the American social fabric. In the Midwest and the South, farmers were being crushed by falling crop prices and the predatory lending of banks and railroads. They rose up in a populist revolt, demanding a People's Party that would challenge the interests of the wealthy elite. Simultaneously, the labor movement began to find its voice in the industrial centers. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago, the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania, and the Pullman Strike in Illinois were not just disputes over wages. They were desperate battles for the dignity of the American worker. These conflicts were often met with state-sponsored violence, as the government frequently sided with the industrial titans. It was an era of intense class warfare that questioned whether the promises of the Declaration of Independence could survive in a world of massive corporations and extreme wealth inequality. By the late 1890s, the United States was no longer content with internal expansion. Having reached the Pacific, the nation began to cast its gaze across the oceans, driven by a mixture of commercial interests, naval strategy, and a lingering sense of manifest destiny. The turning point came in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, sparked by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and fueled by the yellow journalism of Hearst and Pulitzer. The conflict was brief but consequential. Theodore Roosevelt, a charismatic young politician who would soon define the coming century, led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, embodying a new muscular American patriotism. When the smoke cleared, Spain's ancient empire was shattered. The United States emerged as a world power, gaining control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and exerting significant influence over Cuba. This foray into imperialism was a departure from America's traditional isolationism and sparked a fierce national debate. Critics argued that a nation born of a revolution against colonial rule had no business becoming a colonizer itself. Yet, the momentum of the age was unstoppable. The United States was stepping into the 20th century with the confidence of a young giant. The election of 1900 solidified this path, but the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901 catapulted Theodore Roosevelt into the White House, ushering in the progressive era. Roosevelt, with his big stick diplomacy and his square deal for labor, signaled a new role for the federal government, not just as a bystander to the economy, but as a regulator and a mediator. The turn of the century was a time of contradictions. It was an age of soaring skyscrapers and suffocating slums, of incredible technological progress and deep-seated racial segregation, of global power and internal unrest. The Gilded Age had provided the wealth and the infrastructure, but it had also left a trail of social wreckage that the next generation of reformers would have to address. As the bells rang in the year 1900, the United States stood at the center of the world stage, a nation that had successfully bridged its continental divide and was now ready to grapple with the complexities of a new, global century. The foundations had been laid in steel and blood, and the American experiment was about to enter its most expansive and challenging chapter yet, as it prepared to face the world-shattering events of the coming decades. The dawn of the 20th century arrived with a sense of boundless optimism, but the coming decades would test the American spirit in ways previously unimaginable. Under the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt and later Woodrow Wilson, the progressive era sought to tame the excesses of the Gilded Age, introducing labor laws, food safety regulations, and the breaking of massive monopolies. This internal refinement was suddenly interrupted by the cataclysm of World War I. Though the United States initially clung to its isolationist roots, the sinking of American ships and the threat of a shifting global balance forced the nation onto the world stage in 1917. The arrival of millions of American doughboys in Europe provided the decisive weight needed to end the slaughter of the trenches. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the United States was no longer a peripheral player. It had become the world's creditor and a primary architect of the new international order, even as it retreated back into a period of domestic focus during the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties were a fever dream of cultural liberation and economic exuberance. It was the age of jazz, the flapper, and the first mass-produced automobiles rolling off Henry Ford's assembly lines. The invention of the radio brought the nation together in a shared cultural experience, while the skyscrapers of New York and Chicago reached toward a future that seemed paved with gold. But the glitter of the Jazz Age masked deep structural cracks in the global economy and a growing cultural divide between the traditional countryside and the modern city. The party came to a crashing halt in October 1929 when the stock market collapsed, wiping out fortunes overnight and plunging the nation into the Great Depression. This was an era of unprecedented suffering, where the bread line became a staple of American life and the Dust Bowl turned the Great Plains into a wasteland. The American dream seemed to be evaporating, leaving behind a generation of forgotten men, searching for work and dignity. In this moment of despair, Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency, promising a new deal for the American people. Roosevelt's fireside chats used the power of radio to bring hope into living rooms, while his alphabet soup of agencies, the CCC, the WPA, and the SSA, rewrote the social contract between the citizen and the state. The government became the employer of last resort and the guarantor of social security, forever changing the role of federal power. Yet, It was not the New Deal alone that ended the Depression. It was the gathering storm clouds of another global conflict. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 shattered American isolationism forever. The nation transformed into the arsenal of democracy, as factories that once built cars now produced tanks and planes at a rate the world had never seen. World War II demanded a total national mobilization, drawing millions of women into the workforce and setting the stage for the modern civil rights movement as Black Americans fought for freedom abroad while still facing Jim Crow at home. The victory in 1945 left the United States as the world's sole atomic power and the dominant economic force on the planet. The post-war era brought an explosion of prosperity, the birth of the suburbs, and the rise of the middle class. However, the shadow of the mushroom cloud and the ideological chasm with the Soviet Union led to the Cold War, a decades-long struggle for global influence. This era of McCarthyism and fallout shelters was also the era of the space race, culminating in the 1969 moon landing, a feat that captured the world's imagination. But while America looked to the stars, its own streets were filled with the fire of social revolution. The 1950s and 60s saw the rise of the civil rights movement as figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks challenged the nation to finally live up to the promise that all men are created equal. Through boycotts, marches, and the blood of activists, the legal foundations of segregation were finally dismantled with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The late 1960s and 70s were a period of profound disillusionment. The Vietnam War, a grueling and divisive conflict, tore at the national fabric and led to widespread protests, while the Watergate scandal forced the first-ever resignation of a president, Richard Nixon. The nation faced an energy crisis, skyrocketing inflation, and a sense that the American era was in decline. Yet, the 1980s brought a conservative resurgence under Ronald Reagan, who championed a vision of morning in America, and a massive military buildup that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the United States stood as the world's undisputed superpower, presiding over a new era of globalization and the birth of the digital revolution. The Silicon Valley boom and the rise of the Internet promised a new frontier of information and connectivity, further cementing American cultural and economic dominance into the 21st century. The new millennium brought its own set of trials, beginning with the trauma of the September 11 attacks, which pulled the nation into a long and costly war on terror in the Middle East. The Great Recession of 2008 echoed the pains of the past, while the internal political landscape became increasingly polarized. Yet, through every crisis, from the struggle for marriage equality to the challenges of a global pandemic, the American story has remained one of constant evolution. It is a history of a nation that is perpetually under construction, a place where the ideals of the founders are constantly being weighed against the realities of a changing world. From 13 colonies on the edge of a wilderness to a global leader in technology, culture, and science, the United States remains a grand, complex, and often contradictory experiment in self-governance. The story of America is not a finished book, but an ongoing narrative written by the millions of diverse voices who continue to seek a more perfect union in an ever-shifting global landscape.